The wind howled mercilessly as snow battered against the windshield of the sleek, black sedan. James Donovan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the car steady on the icy roads. Chicago was under siege by one of the worst snowstorms in decades, and the city, usually bustling with life, now lay eerily silent, buried under layers of white. James cursed under his breath, his eyes straining to see the road ahead through the blizzard. He had stayed late at the office, negotiating the final details of a deal that would secure his company's position as a leader in the tech industry. But now, as he navigated through the nearly deserted streets, the looming skyscrapers barely visible in the blinding snow, his mind was far from business. The radio crackled to life, broadcasting warnings for people to stay off the roads. The weather service's ominous predictions weren't reassuring, but James had no choice. His mansion on the outskirts of the city was still miles away, and the storm wasn't letting up. The blizzard swallowed his car in every direction, and he barely noticed the figure on the road, until it was almost too late. "Jesus!" James yelled, slamming on the brakes, the car skidding wildly as it came to a stop just inches from a girl standing in the middle of the road. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins as he stared at her, disoriented by her sudden appearance. For a moment, everything stood still. The girl didn't move, her small frame covered in a thin jacket, totally inadequate for the brutal cold. She looked no older than 15 or 16, and her face was pale, almost ghostly, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and confusion. "What the hell is she doing out here?" James muttered to himself, quickly unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, cutting through his expensive coat as if it were nothing. The girl didn't flinch as he approached. "Hey!" he shouted over the wind. "Are you all right? What are you doing out here?" The girl blinked slowly, as though trying to process his words. She didn't answer. James looked around, but there was no one else in sight. No cars, no people, just the endless snow. His breath came out in misty clouds as he approached her cautiously. Something was very wrong. "Come on, you can't stay here," James urged, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "You'll freeze to death." Her body stiffened under his hand, but she didn't resist as he guided her toward his car. As they neared the vehicle, she whispered something, barely audible over the howling wind. "What was that?" James asked, leaning closer. I don't know where I am," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her words sent a chill down his spine, colder than the winter air. He opened the passenger door and helped her inside, noticing how her entire body shook uncontrollably from the cold. Once she was settled, James got back into the driver's seat, glancing at her again. Her hands were red from the frost, and she huddled into herself, staring straight ahead. He turned the heater on full blast, trying to thaw out the interior. "Do you need me to take you somewhere?" he asked, though he wasn't sure where she could possibly need to go in this storm. She shook her head, her eyes hollow, still not meeting his gaze. James frowned. "What's your name?" She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze shifted slightly, focusing on something far off in the distance, as if she was seeing something he couldn't. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, trying to figure out what to do. Leaving her out here wasn't an option, but the mansion was still a long drive away. The roads were getting worse, and he knew he couldn't take any more risks out here. "You're coming with me," he said decisively, putting the car back in gear. "I live just outside the city. We'll figure this out there." As they drove in tense silence, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this girl, something he couldn't quite place. There was a familiarity about her, something that gnawed at the back of his mind, though he was sure he had never seen her before. Who was she? And what was she doing out here in the middle of a deadly snowstorm? The answers, he feared, might be more than he bargained for. The tires of James's car crunched against the snow-covered driveway as they pulled up to his mansion. The storm had intensified, blanketing the area in a thick layer of snow. The grand estate, with its high walls and gated entrance, seemed like a fortress, isolated from the rest of the world. James glanced over at the girl, who remained silent beside him, her eyes still distant, almost vacant. She hadn't said a word during the entire drive, and he could feel the tension hanging in the air between them. His mind raced with questions, but he knew it wasn't the time to push. Whoever she was, she clearly needed help. He pressed the remote to open the gate, the iron bars slowly creaking open. The mansion loomed ahead, its lights cutting through the blizzard like beacons. Once inside the safety of the garage, James turned off the engine and exhaled, the silence inside the car suddenly deafening. "You're safe now," he said softly, turning to her. "Let's get inside." "You're freezing." The girl still didn't respond, but she nodded slightly. Her face was pale, and her hands shook from the cold, though whether from the temperature or fear, James couldn't tell. He opened his door and hurried around to help her out, the biting wind hitting him as soon as he stepped outside. He shielded her from the worst of the storm as they made their way to the door. Inside, the warmth of the mansion enveloped them immediately. The foyer was spacious, with high ceilings and elegant furnishings, but James barely noticed. His focus was on the girl, who stood awkwardly by the door, her wet clothes dripping onto the marble floor. "I'll get you some dry clothes," James said, already walking toward a nearby closet. He grabbed a soft, oversized robe and returned to her, holding it out. "Here, you can change in the bathroom. It's just down the hall." For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed to hesitate, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. James gave her a reassuring smile. "Take your time. I'll be right here." She took the robe from his hands, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. Her touch was cold as ice, and for a second, James felt a strange sensation, something he couldn't quite place, like a jolt of recognition, though he knew it was impossible. He had never seen this girl before. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she disappeared down the hall. James watched her go, his mind swirling with confusion. Something about this whole situation was off, and he couldn't shake the growing unease settling in his chest. The way she appeared in the middle of the storm, her strange, almost haunted demeanor, it didn't add up. And then there was that feeling, that inexplicable sense of familiarity he had when she touched him. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. Maybe she was just in shock. The storm had probably disoriented her, and who knew what she had been through. He just needed to give her time to open up. James moved to the living room, the fire already crackling in the fireplace. He grabbed his phone, intending to call the authorities, but something stopped him. What would he even tell them? He didn't know who she was, and it was clear she wasn't ready to talk. Maybe it was better to wait until she felt more comfortable before getting anyone else involved. As he debated what to do, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to see the girl standing in the doorway, wrapped in the robe he had given her. Her wet hair clung to her face, but she looked warmer now, her cheeks flushed from the heat inside the house. "Feel better?" James asked, trying to keep his tone light. She nodded, her eyes flickering around the room, taking in the luxurious surroundings. It was clear she felt out of place, and James couldn't blame her. The mansion was a far cry from whatever she had been through before he found her. "Come, sit by the fire," he offered, gesturing to the armchair near the hearth. "You must be exhausted." She moved cautiously, sitting down on the edge of the chair as if she didn't quite belong there. The flames reflected in her wide eyes, and for the first time, James saw something besides fear, a deep sadness buried beneath her silence. He sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "Do you want to tell me what happened? Where were you going in the middle of that storm?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. The crackling fire filled the room, the warmth almost comforting despite the heavy tension hanging between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I don't remember." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by her response. "You don't remember anything?" She shook her head slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the robe. "I don't even know how I got there. I just woke up and I was on the road. It's all blank." James frowned, leaning back in his chair. Amnesia? He had heard of cases like this before, but it was rare. Her confusion seemed genuine, but something still didn't sit right with him. People didn't just wake up in the middle of a blizzard with no memory of how they got there. "Do you have any ID? Anything I can use to help figure out who you are?" he asked, hoping for some clue. She hesitated, her hands instinctively reaching for her jacket, which she had left behind when she changed. I I don't know. James stood up, walking over to where her clothes were draped across the back of a chair. He rifled through her jacket pockets, his fingers brushing against something hard. He pulled out a small locket, its surface worn and tarnished. The clasp was broken, and it looked old, much older than anything a teenager would typically carry. He held it up, his brow furrowing. "Is this yours?" She stared at the locket, her face draining of color as she looked at it. For the first time, true fear flickered across her face, and she recoiled slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, it's not mine. I don't know where it came from." James's heart skipped a beat as he studied her reaction. The fear in her eyes wasn't just confusion anymore. It was something deeper, something darker. And suddenly, he realized that this girl's story was far more complicated than he had imagined. The locket dangled from James's fingers, glinting in the firelight, but all he could focus on was the look on the girl's face, pale, wide-eyed, and full of terror. The fear that flickered in her gaze wasn't the fleeting kind, the sort you'd expect from a young girl in distress. No, this was different. It ran deeper, chilling him more than the biting wind that had howled outside just minutes before. He set the locket down on the coffee table, careful not to push her further. Her entire body seemed to tense, as if she was ready to bolt the moment he asked another question. "Okay," James said softly, hands raised in a calming gesture. "We don't have to talk about it right now, but if that locket doesn't belong to you, how did it end up with your things?" Her lips trembled, and her hands gripped the edges of her robe tighter, knuckles turning white. "I don't know," she whispered, eyes darting away as if searching for an escape. "I don't remember anything about it." James took a deep breath, trying to keep his own rising unease under control. There was a heaviness in the air now, something thick and unspoken between them. He could feel it, the unshakable sense that something was horribly wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Look, I'm not trying to scare you," he said gently, sitting back down in the armchair across from her. "I just want to help. Maybe we can figure this out together, all right? You're safe here." The girl nodded stiffly, but her eyes kept flicking toward the locket, as if it were some dangerous relic from her past. James followed her gaze and decided to push it a little further. "Does it trigger anything? Any memories at all?" Her lips parted as if she were about to answer, but then her face tightened, and she shook her head rapidly, almost too quickly. "No, nothing. I can't remember." Her voice wavered, and James could hear the frustration, or fear, underneath the words. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his mind racing. "All right, let's leave that for now. Can you at least tell me your name?" For a long time, she didn't answer. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence between them with the occasional pop of burning wood. Finally, she looked up, her eyes locking with his for the first time since they'd entered the house. "My name is Emily," she said softly, almost uncertain. James frowned. There was something in the way she said it that didn't sit right with him. A hesitation, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Was that really her name? Or was she just grasping for something familiar? "Emily," James repeated, trying to gauge her reaction. "That's a start. Emily, is there anyone we can call for you? Anyone who might be worried about where you are?" She shook her head again, her hands tightening around the robe like a protective shield. "There's no one." The way she said it, flat, devoid of emotion, made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand on end. He couldn't tell if she was hiding something, or if her mind was truly a blank slate. But either way, it didn't sit right with him. Before he could press further, a loud clang echoed from the other side of the room. They both jumped, turning toward the source of the noise. A gust of wind had slammed against one of the large windows, rattling the panes and making the mansion feel suddenly colder. James shook his head, trying to laugh off the tension. "Just the wind," he muttered, though his heart was still racing. "This storm is really picking up." Emily didn't respond. Her gaze had shifted again, this time to a painting hanging above the fireplace. It was a portrait of James and his family, taken years ago before everything fell apart. His ex-wife had insisted on commissioning the piece, back when they were still a unit, back when their daughter was still. James froze, his thoughts crashing to a halt as he followed Emily's gaze. She was staring at the part of the painting where his daughter, Lily, stood. Her long brown hair, her soft smile, and the birthmark on her neck, visible even in the painting. A mark that had always been unique to Lily, a small, crescent-shaped blemish just beneath her ear. James felt his heart drop into his stomach. His mouth went dry, and suddenly, it felt like the room was closing in on him. Emily was still staring at the painting, her eyes wide, and slowly, almost subconsciously, she raised her hand to her own neck, brushing her fingers against the spot where Lily's birthmark would be. James's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have a birthmark?" Her hand froze, hovering just above her neck. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time, James saw the faintest glimmer of recognition in her eyes. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, moving toward her with deliberate, cautious steps. Emily began, her voice shaky, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know. I don't remember." But James already knew. His mind was racing, memories flooding back to him in a chaotic rush. Lily had died in a car accident. He had been told she had died. He had seen the wreckage, had been at the funeral. But standing in front of him now was a girl, a stranger, who somehow looked exactly like his daughter. The same eyes, the same hair, and that birthmark. "No," James whispered, his voice cracking. "This can't be real." Emily stared at him, her face a mixture of confusion and fear, and in that moment, James felt the weight of years of grief and regret crash over him like a tidal wave. He had mourned her, had spent years trying to bury the pain, to move on. But now, the impossible was standing right in front of him. He couldn't breathe. "Lily?" The name slipped out before he could stop it, a desperate whisper that hung in the air between them. Emily's eyes widened, and she stumbled back, shaking her head. "No, I'm not. I can't be." But James was already reaching out, his hands trembling. "It's you. It has to be you. My daughter. Lily, you survived, didn't you? They lied to me. You're alive." Tears streamed down Emily's face now, and she backed away, her hands pressed to her temples as if the world around her was collapsing. "No, no, no. I don't know who I am. Please, stop. I don't remember." James's heart shattered at the sight of her. The fear in her eyes, the pain in her voice. It was tearing him apart. He had spent years believing his daughter was gone. But now, this girl who had appeared out of nowhere was pulling at every raw nerve, every piece of hope he had long buried. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know. He had to be sure. "Lily," he whispered again, his voice trembling with desperation. "Please, just tell me." Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, and James could only stand there, helpless, watching as the girl he was sure was his daughter fell apart right in front of him. James stood frozen, his chest tightening with each of Emily's sobs. The once confident tech mogul, who had spent years in boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals, now felt completely powerless. His world had tilted on its axis, and he didn't know how to bring it back into balance. The fire crackled softly behind him, but its warmth couldn't touch the icy realization gripping him. This girl, this broken, terrified girl, might be his daughter. The daughter he had mourned. The daughter he thought had died in a mangled wreck of twisted metal and shattered glass, could be right in front of him, alive. He took a step toward her, his heart pounding in his ears. Emily was on her knees, her face buried in her hands, her sobs echoing through the large room. She looked so small, so fragile. The image of his daughter, Lily, flashed in his mind. Her giggles when he'd toss her in the air, her shy smile when she'd ask him for bedtime stories. That same smallness, that same fragility. His throat tightened. "Emily," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Please look at me." But she didn't. Her body shook violently as she tried to catch her breath between sobs. James could see the agony she was going through, and it tore at his soul. He didn't want to push her, but he had to know the truth. He needed to know. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her shoulder. "Please," he said again, his voice cracking with emotion. "Just tell me who you really are." Emily's sobs quieted for a moment. She raised her head slightly, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She stared at him, her expression a mix of fear, confusion, and something else, something James couldn't quite place. "I don't know," she choked out, her voice hoarse. "I swear, I don't remember anything." James's heart clenched. He could see that she was struggling, that whatever was locked inside her mind was tormenting her. But how could she not know? How could she not remember who she was? He searched her face, desperately looking for any sign, any flicker of recognition that could confirm his growing suspicion. But then she did something that sent a chill down his spine. With trembling hands, she reached up to her neck, pulling aside a strand of her hair. Her fingers hesitated for a moment, and then she gently touched a spot just below her ear. The exact spot where his daughter's birthmark had been. James felt the air rush out of his lungs. It was real. It was the same. He had seen that mark every day of his daughter's life. A small, crescent-shaped birthmark that had been there since the day she was born. And now, here it was, staring back at him like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. "Oh my God," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's you." Emily's eyes widened, her hand still hovering over the mark, and for the briefest of moments, something flickered in her expression, something close to recognition. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic. "No!" she cried out, scrambling backward, her back hitting the edge of the coffee table. "I don't know who I am. I don't know anything about this." James moved toward her instinctively, his hands reaching out, trying to calm her. "Emily, Lily, please listen to me. You have to understand." "No," she shouted, cutting him off. "I'm not her. I can't be her. I don't know who Lily is." Her voice cracked, her breathing coming in ragged gasps as she backed away, trying to put as much distance between them as possible. "You're wrong. You're confusing me with someone else." The pain in her voice shattered what little composure James had left. He could see that she was spiraling, her mind overwhelmed with fear and confusion, and he knew he had to pull back. But how could he? How could he step away when everything in him screamed that this was his daughter? His Lily, alive? "Okay," James said softly, holding his hands up to show he wasn't going to come any closer. "Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push you. Just breathe, all right? Just breathe." Emily's chest heaved as she struggled to calm herself. Her eyes darted around the room, wild and unfocused, as if she were searching for an escape. James stayed still, giving her space, but his mind raced. He had to know what had happened. If she was Lily, how had she survived the accident? Where had she been all these years? And why didn't she remember any of it? As the moments stretched out in agonizing silence, Emily finally began to calm. Her breathing slowed, her eyes losing some of their frantic energy. But the fear was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. James exhaled slowly, trying to gather his thoughts. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to understand. If you're not Lily, then who are you?" She looked up at him, her lips trembling. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've told you. I don't remember anything. I just woke up in the snow. I don't know how I got there. I don't even know where I came from." James felt a pang of guilt. She wasn't lying. He could see it in her eyes. Whatever had happened to her, it had wiped away everything. But the birthmark, the way she looked, the locket, there were too many coincidences. Too many things that pointed to one horrifying possibility. What if? James's voice wavered as he spoke, his mind grappling with the unthinkable. What if someone took you? After the accident? What if they made you forget? Emily blinked, her brows furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" James stood up, pacing back and forth as his thoughts tumbled out. What if the accident wasn't an accident at all? What if someone took you, and they made you forget who you are? What if that's why you can't remember? Emily's face went pale, her hands shaking. "That doesn't make sense." Why would someone do that? I don't know, James admitted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. But I swear, you look exactly like her. You have her birthmark. You have to be her. Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes again. I don't feel like anyone. I feel lost, empty. Her voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. James knelt down in front of her again, his heart breaking at the sight of her pain. Listen, he said softly, his voice full of desperation. We don't have to figure this out tonight. But I promise you, I'm going to help you, no matter what it takes. You're not alone in this. Emily looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. For the briefest moment, something shifted between them. An unspoken connection, fragile but real. James felt it in his gut. He knew that look. He had seen it in his daughter's eyes once. But before either of them could say another word, the sound of a phone ringing cut through the air, shattering the moment. James blinked, startled. The sound was coming from Emily's coat, the coat she had been wearing when he found her. He stood quickly, grabbing the coat from the chair and digging into the pocket. His hand closed around a cell phone, its screen lighting up with an unknown number. He glanced at Emily, who stared at the phone in confusion, clearly as shocked as he was. Her hands trembled as he handed her the phone. Who is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, James said, his pulse quickening. But maybe it's someone who knows you. Emily's hands shook as she looked at the phone, then back at James, fear flickering in her eyes. James's mind raced. Whoever was calling might have answers. Whoever was on the other end of that line could know what had happened to her, could know if she really was Lily. Answer it, James urged, his heart pounding in his chest. With trembling fingers, Emily slowly pressed the button and lifted the phone to her ear. Hello, she whispered, her voice shaking. There was a pause, and then Emily's face went pale. Her eyes widened in horror, and she dropped the phone, letting it clatter to the floor. Who was it? James demanded, his voice filled with alarm. But Emily didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the phone in silent terror, her body frozen as if she had seen a ghost. James felt the room shrink around him as he stared at Emily, who stood frozen, her face drained of color, her eyes locked in terror on the phone that now lay on the floor. It felt as though time had stopped, the crackling fire in the hearth and the howling wind outside all fading into an eerie, oppressive silence. He moved first, crossing the distance between them in seconds, scooping up the phone from where it had fallen. His fingers were shaking as he stared at the screen. The call had already ended. Who was it? James asked, his voice urgent but soft, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile girl in front of him. What did they say? Emily didn't respond. She stood there, trembling, her wide eyes distant, as if her mind had been dragged somewhere far beyond the room they were standing in. It was as if she was no longer present, lost in some nightmare only she could see. Emily, James pressed, this time louder, his voice breaking through her trance. She flinched at the sound of her name, her body jerking slightly as if waking from a dream. Slowly, her eyes focused on him, and for the first time since he had found her, the depth of her fear truly hit him. This wasn't just confusion or panic. She was terrified. Of what? He didn't know yet, but it was clear now that she was running from something far darker than he had imagined. I don't know, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, but there was no hiding the quiver in her words. The voice, it said. She trailed off, her hands coming up to clutch the sides of her head, as though trying to block out the memory. James's heart raced. What did the voice say, Emily? Please, you need to tell me. Her breathing quickened, her chest heaving as she fought to find the words. It said, you don't belong there. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as if to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. It said they're coming for me, and I have to leave. James felt his stomach lurch. Someone was looking for her. Whoever had called knew where she was, knew she was with him. But how? And worse, what did they want with her? What else did they say? James pressed, his pulse pounding in his ears. Did they say who they were? Emily shook her head violently, taking a step back, as if trying to distance herself from the phone, from the reality of what was happening. No, I don't know. They just said I have to go. I can't stay here. Her voice was rising, her panic overwhelming her as she began to back away further, her eyes darting toward the door. James's mind raced, a mix of dread and confusion swirling within him. He couldn't let her leave, not like this, not into the storm. Especially not if someone dangerous was after her. He had to protect her, but how could he do that when he didn't even know what or who was coming? Emily, wait. James stepped forward, trying to stay calm even as his heart raced. You don't have to go anywhere. You're safe here. No one can get to you. I promise. But his words seemed to have the opposite effect. Emily's breathing quickened, her eyes wild with fear, and she began backing away more rapidly, her back hitting the wall. No, you don't understand. I have to leave. They're coming, and I can't be here when they... She cut off, her voice choking on the last words as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. James could feel her terror, palpable and suffocating, and it gripped him with the same intensity. Whoever had called her wasn't just a random stranger. This was someone who knew exactly where she was and what she was running from. Emily, please. James's voice cracked as he reached out, trying to stop her from spiraling further. I don't know what's happening, but if someone's coming for you, you're safer here than out there in that storm. I won't let anyone hurt you. She paused for just a moment, her body trembling, and for the briefest of seconds, James thought he'd reached her. But then, her face twisted in pain, and she shook her head desperately. I can't stay here. You don't know them. You don't know what they'll do. Her words hit James like a punch to the gut. His mind spun with the implications. Who were they? What kind of people could make her this terrified? Emily, he said, his voice low but firm. I don't care who they are. I'll protect you. We can call the police, get help, but please, don't leave. Not like this. For a moment, it seemed like she might listen. Her eyes softened, the wild panic in her expression flickering with uncertainty. But then, as if some terrible thought took hold of her again, she straightened up, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. The desperation in her eyes returned tenfold. They'll kill you, she whispered, her voice trembling. They'll kill you if you try to stop them. I can't be the reason you die. The words sent a cold shiver down James's spine, but he refused to let the fear take hold. He took a deep breath and closed the distance between them, gently gripping her shoulders. Listen to me, he said firmly, forcing her to look into his eyes. I don't know who these people are, but they're not going to hurt me, and they're not going to hurt you. I've lost too much already. I'm not losing you too. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she collapsed into his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. James held her tightly, his mind reeling with everything she'd just said. This wasn't just about her memory loss. There was something bigger at play here, something dangerous. As he held her, James's gaze shifted to the window, where the storm raged outside, the wind howling like a beast. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Who had taken her? And why? The phone in his hand buzzed suddenly, startling him. The same unknown number flashed across the screen, and his heart leapt into his throat. They're calling again, he whispered, his grip tightening on the phone. Emily tensed in his arms, her sobs quieting as she pulled back to look at him, her face pale with fear. Don't answer it, she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. Please don't. James hesitated. Whoever was on the other end of that call had the answers. But he could see the terror in Emily's eyes, the absolute dread that gripped her at the thought of what might happen if he answered. He didn't know what to do. The phone buzzed again, and he made his decision. With a deep breath, James pressed the button and lifted the phone to his ear. Hello? He said, his voice steady despite the fear pounding in his chest. There was silence on the other end of the line. And then, finally, a voice, low, calm, and eerily composed. You should have let her go, Mr. Donovan. The color drained from James's face. The voice was male, and though it was quiet, there was a chilling authority in the way the words were spoken. Whoever this was, they knew who he was, and they were already watching. Before James could respond, the voice continued. We know where you are. We know everything about you. And if you don't do exactly as we say, you'll regret it. Let her go, or the next storm that hits your house won't be a snowstorm. The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his hands trembling, the weight of the threat sinking in. He looked at Emily, her tear-filled eyes locked on his. What did they say? She whispered, her voice shaking. James's mind raced. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was, but he couldn't lie to her either. They said, We're being watched, he said quietly. And if we don't do what they want, his voice trailed off, but Emily already understood. The terror in her eyes returned, more intense than before. They'll kill us both, she whispered, her voice hollow. And for the first time since this nightmare began, James truly believed it. The silence after the call was suffocating. James stood motionless, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind reeling from the weight of the threat. His mansion, once a fortress of security and solitude, now felt exposed, vulnerable, like a glass house surrounded by unseen enemies. Across from him, Emily's breathing had quickened again, her eyes wide with terror as she hugged herself, shrinking against the wall. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on them, the oppressive fear thickening the air around them. They're watching us, she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. They know where we are. I told you they would come. James's heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable and dangerous. He clenched his fists, trying to think, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I don't care who they are, he said firmly, though his voice betrayed the fear that had crept into his veins. I won't let them take you, Emily. I don't know what's going on, but I promise you, I'll keep you safe. Emily shook her head frantically, her eyes darting between James and the window, as if expecting a shadowy figure to burst through at any moment. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You can't stop them. No one can. They already took everything from me. They erased me. James frowned, stepping closer to her. What do you mean? Who are these people? What did they do to you? She squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to block out the images in her mind. Her hands gripped her head tightly, and she slid down the wall to the floor, her knees drawn to her chest. I don't know, she cried out. I don't remember. I don't even know if Emily is my real name. James felt a chill run down his spine. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. If she wasn't sure of her own name, if her entire identity had been wiped clean, then the people after her weren't just some random criminals. This was something far more insidious, far more calculated. He crouched down in front of her, his voice soft but urgent. We'll figure this out, I swear. But right now, you need to trust me. I need to know everything you can remember, no matter how small. There has to be something. Emily's hands trembled as she wiped her tears, struggling to calm herself. She looked at him, her face pale and drawn, and then finally, she spoke. I remember the car, she whispered. The night of the accident, the crash. There was glass everywhere, and blood. I thought I died. James's heart skipped a beat. The crash. He remembered it all too well. The night that had destroyed his world. The night that had taken Lily from him. Could it be? Could she really be talking about the same accident? His mind raced, trying to piece it together. But then I woke up, she continued, her voice shaky. In a room. A small, cold room. There were no windows, just a bed and machines. People came and went, but I couldn't see their faces. They never let me see their faces. James swallowed hard, his mind spinning. Whoever had taken her, if she was indeed Lily, had kept her somewhere, hidden, erased from existence. But why? And how had she ended up on that road in the snow, with no memory of who she was? Do you remember anything about the people? James asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Their voices, anything they said? Emily's eyes glazed over, her expression distant, as though she were lost in the fragments of her fractured memories. They called me something. Not Emily. Not Lily. She paused, her brow furrowing as she struggled to recall the word. It was the number. They kept calling me by a number. A number? James repeated, a knot forming in his stomach. What number? 6, she whispered, her voice cracking. They called me 6. The air left James's lungs as if he had been punched in the gut. 6. It wasn't a name. It wasn't even an identity. It was a label, cold and impersonal, as though they had stripped her of everything that made her a person. Her name, her past, her family, and reduced her to nothing but a number. Emily, James began, but she cut him off. That's all I remember, she said, her voice shaking. Everything else is just flashes. I don't know how long I was there, or how I got out. One day, I was just on the road, and you found me. That's it. That's all I know. James ran a hand over his face, his mind spinning with the weight of it all. She had been taken, kept somewhere, held against her will, and stripped of her identity. But by who? And why? His instinct screamed that whoever had done this was dangerous, far more dangerous than he had originally thought. They're coming for me, Emily whispered, her eyes filling with fresh tears. They won't stop until they find me. James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with determination. Not if I can help it, he muttered. We're not just going to sit here and wait for them. Emily looked at him, confused. What do you mean? We're going to fight back, James said, standing up. I have resources. I can protect you. But first, we need to find out who these people are and why they want you. He grabbed his phone again, but this time, it wasn't to answer any calls. He was about to make one, to someone who could help. There was a man, an old friend from his days as a CEO, someone who specialized in cybersecurity and information retrieval. James hadn't spoken to him in years, but if anyone could dig into the shadows and find out who was behind this, it was him. As the phone rang, Emily watched him, her fear still evident, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. The line clicked, and a voice came on the other end. James Donovan? This is a surprise. Eric, James said, his voice steady. I need your help. It's urgent. There was a pause on the other end, a brief silence before Eric's voice responded, cautious but curious. What kind of help? James hesitated, glancing at Emily, who looked back at him with wide, tear-streaked eyes. Someone's coming for me, and for someone I'm protecting. I need you to dig into whoever's behind it. It's not normal. These people, they're dangerous. Eric's tone shifted immediately, growing more serious. How dangerous are we talking? James swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to the voice on the phone, the calm, threatening words. Let her go, or the next storm that hits your house won't be a snowstorm. Dangerous enough that they'll kill us if we don't stop them. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Eric's voice returned, quieter but firm. All right, I'll see what I can find. Send me everything you have. James hung up, feeling a weight lift slightly from his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They wouldn't be sitting ducks. They would fight back. He turned to Emily, his eyes softening as he saw the fear still etched on her face. We'll figure this out. I promise. Emily nodded slowly, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. She stood up shakily, glancing toward the window where the snow continued to fall heavily outside. They're coming, she whispered again, almost to herself. And when they do, we won't be able to stop them. James took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, he would fight until the very end to keep her safe. He had already lost too much in his life. He wouldn't lose her again, whether she was Lily or not. Let them come, James said quietly, but with an edge of steel in his voice. We'll be ready. But as the storm raged on outside, and the shadows inched closer, James couldn't shake the sinking feeling that they were already too late. The wind outside howled louder than before, rattling the windows as if the storm itself was knocking, demanding entry. The warmth of the mansion seemed fragile now, like a thin layer of protection against the growing dread that clung to the air. James moved around the room with purpose, though inside, he was fighting to keep his fear in check. His call to Eric had given him a thread of hope, but the weight of the situation still bore down on him heavily. He had no idea how much time they had or how far the people after Emily, or Lily, were willing to go. All he knew was that they had made a promise, a deadly promise, and they weren't bluffing. Emily sat on the couch, still wrapped in the oversized robe, her body small and trembling. Her eyes followed James as he moved about, her expression filled with silent terror. The fire crackled softly in the background, but its warmth couldn't touch the chill that had settled over them. James glanced out the window, his mind racing. The snow was falling even harder now, and visibility was practically zero. If they were coming for her, they'd be fighting the storm too. But how long could that really delay them? Hours? Minutes? I need to make sure all the doors are locked, James muttered, more to himself than to Emily. He was grasping for control. Anything that would help him feel like he could protect them from the invisible threat closing in. As he moved toward the front door, Emily's voice, small and shaky, broke the silence. It won't matter, you know. James froze, his hand hovering over the lock. He turned slowly to look at her, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? They'll find a way in, she whispered, her eyes hollow, as if she was already seeing something terrible unfold in her mind. They always do. I don't know how, but they always do. James clenched his jaw, refusing to give in to the fear that was rising in his chest. Not this time, he said firmly. This house is locked down like a fortress. I've got security systems in place, cameras. If anyone so much as sets foot near this place, I'll know. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt a sliver of doubt creep in. Whoever these people were, they had resources. They had found Emily, had tracked her here. They had already breached his life without him even knowing. Would locks and cameras really be enough? Emily didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with an unsettling certainty. She wasn't just afraid of being found. She knew they would be. It was as though she had seen this play out before, like a nightmare that kept repeating itself no matter how far she tried to run. James locked the door anyway, the heavy click echoing through the quiet mansion. He moved to the windows next, pulling the thick curtains closed, shutting out the view of the blizzard that raged outside. Each movement was deliberate, but inside, his thoughts were anything but calm. When he returned to the living room, Emily was still in the same position, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes distant. The girl looked lost, broken, like someone who had already given up. James couldn't stand seeing her like that. He knelt in front of her, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me, he said softly, but with a fierce determination. I don't care who these people are or what they've done to you. We're going to stop them. You're not alone in this. She looked at him, her expression blank for a moment, and then her lower lip trembled as more tears welled up in her eyes. You don't understand, she whispered. They took everything from me. They made me forget who I am. They'll do the same to you if you try to fight them. James's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay strong. I'm not going to let that happen. Emily shook her head, fresh tears spilling over as she looked away. They're not like other people, James. I don't know what they are, but they can't be stopped. I can't let you get hurt because of me. Stop, James said, his voice firm but gentle. You're not leaving, and I'm not letting them take you again. I don't care what it takes. He stood up, his hands on his hips, and exhaled slowly, trying to clear his mind. He needed to think. He needed to figure out a plan. His thoughts drifted back to the phone call, the cold, emotionless voice that had warned him. Let her go, or the next storm that hits your house won't be a snowstorm. What kind of storm were they threatening? What did that mean? As if in answer to his thoughts, the power suddenly flickered. James's heart skipped a beat. He looked up, watching as the lights dimmed for a moment, casting the room into shadows before surging back to life. The fire continued to crackle, but the warmth now felt fragile, like a candle flickering in a windstorm. Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. They're here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. James's blood ran cold. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the storm had just messed with the power lines. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. Another flicker. This time, the lights dimmed for longer, the darkness stretching just a bit too far before the power returned. James's heart raced, and he hurried over to the wall panel where the security system was. His fingers moved quickly across the keypad, checking the perimeter cameras. The screens blinked to life, showing the exterior of the house. The long driveway leading up to the mansion, the snow-covered grounds, the gate that stood between them and the outside world. But something was wrong. The image flickered, static cutting across the feed for a split second, and then it cleared. James frowned, leaning closer to the screen. There was something out there. A shadow, just beyond the gate. He squinted, trying to make out the figure through the grainy image, but the storm made it impossible to see clearly. He switched to the camera closer to the gate, but it, too, flickered with static. His frustration mounted. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, punching in more commands. Emily had moved to his side now, her face pale as she stared at the screens. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," James admitted. "The cameras are glitching. It could just be the storm messing with the signal." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't the storm. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness, the fire casting faint, dancing shadows against the walls. Emily gasped, her hand instinctively clutching James's arm. James's breath quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's okay," he said, though his voice was strained. "I've got a backup generator. It'll kick in soon." But as the seconds stretched on, the house remained dark, save for the soft glow of the fire. "They're inside," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. James shook his head, his mind racing. No, they can't be. The house is locked down and I would have seen." A loud bang echoed through the mansion, cutting him off. The sound reverberated through the walls, as if something, or someone, had struck the side of the house. The noise was followed by another, and then another, the rhythmic pounding growing louder, closer. Emily's grip on his arm tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We need to hide," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're here." James felt his heart hammering in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had been in countless high-pressure situations throughout his career, hostile takeovers, financial crises, but none of that had prepared him for this. For the primal terror clawing at his gut, the realization that they were not just being hunted, but that whoever, or whatever, was coming for them was already inside his fortress. "We need to get to the basement," James said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "It's the most secure part of the house." He grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the back of the mansion. They moved quickly, the darkness around them thick and oppressive. The pounding grew louder, each thud reverberating through the walls as if something was closing in, something relentless and unstoppable. As they reached the door to the basement, James yanked it open, ushering Emily inside. The steps creaked under their weight as they descended into the lower level, the cold stone walls surrounding them like the inside of a tomb. The door slammed shut behind them, and James fumbled in the darkness for the backup lights. When they flickered on, the basement was bathed in a dim, sterile glow. But the pounding hadn't stopped. It was getting louder. "They're coming," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. James took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he grabbed a crowbar from a shelf. He wasn't sure how much use it would be, but he wasn't going down without a fight. As they stood there, waiting, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoed above them, moving slowly through the mansion. They had made it inside. The footsteps above them grew louder, each thud against the floorboards sending a tremor through the basement walls. James stood frozen, the crowbar clutched in his hand, his breath shallow as he listened to the rhythmic, methodical pacing. Whoever, or whatever, was up there wasn't in any hurry. They were taking their time, almost as if they knew exactly where James and Emily were hiding. Beside him, Emily shivered uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to disappear into the corner of the room. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with terror. The dim basement light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance with the fear that filled the air. "They're here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with dread. "They're inside, James. I told you. I told you they'd find us." James squeezed the crowbar tighter, his knuckles turning white. His mind raced, trying to calculate their options, but every possible escape seemed to crumble before it could fully form. He wasn't prepared for this. No security system, no amount of money or influence could have protected them from what was coming. The heavy footsteps continued to move above, slow and deliberate, as if the intruder was searching, taunting. James's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as the reality of the situation closed in. Whoever was upstairs had bypassed every layer of security he had in place. They were professionals, dangerous, calculating, and completely confident that they had James and Emily trapped. "James." Emily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Her eyes were filled with tears now, her body trembling with fear. I don't want to die." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. James had always been a man of control, someone who could handle any situation, no matter how dire. But now, standing in this cold basement, with the sound of footsteps growing closer, he realized just how powerless he really was. He knelt down beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I won't let them hurt you," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the doubt gnawing at his insides. "I promise, we're going to get through this. But you have to stay calm. We need to think." Emily looked at him, her eyes desperate, clinging to the shred of hope he offered. But deep down, they both knew that hope was running thin. The footsteps stopped. James held his breath, listening intently. The air in the basement seemed to grow thicker, every creak of the old house amplified in the silence. Then, the soft sound of something being dragged across the floor, the unmistakable scrape of metal, echoed through the space above them. James's blood ran cold. They weren't just searching. They were preparing for something. "We have to move," James whispered, his heart pounding in his ears. "We can't just stay down here. There's a back entrance through the cellar. If we can make it outside, the storm might cover our tracks." Emily's eyes widened. "You think we can outrun them? In this storm?" "I don't know," James admitted, his voice tight with fear. "But if we stay here, we're sitting ducks." Before Emily could respond, the footsteps resumed, this time descending the stairs toward the basement door. The creaking of the old wood under their weight was slow, menacing, like the steps of a predator closing in on its prey. Emily whimpered softly, and James pulled her closer, his mind racing. The cellar door wasn't far. It was tucked behind a stack of old storage crates. If they could just reach it before whoever was coming found them, they might have a chance. James motioned toward the far corner of the room. "Go. Slowly. I'll follow." Emily hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the basement door, where the footsteps were growing louder. But then, she nodded, swallowing hard as she began to inch her way toward the cellar door, her steps careful and silent. James followed close behind, the crowbar still gripped tightly in his hand, ready for whatever might be waiting for them. The sound of the basement door handle turning made James's heart skip a beat. His pulse thundered in his ears as he and Emily pressed themselves against the wall, hidden in the shadows of the dimly lit room. The door creaked open slowly, and the air shifted as the intruder entered the basement. For a moment, everything was still. James could feel Emily's breath against his arm, rapid and shallow, as they huddled together in the darkness. He didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The figure stepped further into the room, and James could make out the faint outline of a tall, broad-shouldered man. The intruder moved with the slow, deliberate precision of someone who knew exactly where his targets were hiding. The soft shuffle of footsteps echoed off the cold stone walls as he scanned the room, his movements calm, almost unhurried. James's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. The cellar door was just a few feet away, but every step they took could give away their position. One wrong move, one creak of the floorboards, and the man would find them. The intruder stopped again, this time near the far end of the room. James watched, breathless, as the man knelt down, inspecting something on the floor. An old crate, perhaps, or one of the storage shelves. He seemed to be searching for something, but James couldn't tell what. Suddenly, The man straightened up, his head turning slowly in their direction. James's breath caught in his throat. Could he see them? Was he just toying with them, waiting to strike? Emily trembled beside him, her body pressed tightly against his. She was holding back tears, her fear palpable in the air between them. The man took another step toward them. James's grip on the crowbar tightened, every muscle in his body tense and ready. If the man got any closer, there would be no choice but to fight. He would have to make a move, attack, do something to protect Emily. Another step. The man was close now, too close. James could see the outline of his face, the glint of something metallic in his hand, a weapon. James's heart raced. He couldn't wait any longer. Just as he was about to lunge, the faint sound of a phone buzzing cut through the air, stopping him dead in his tracks. It wasn't his phone. It was the man's. The intruder hesitated, reaching into his pocket to retrieve the device. James could barely hear the faint conversation as the man pressed the phone to his ear. Whoever was on the other end must have given new instructions, because the man nodded once, then turned abruptly and headed back up the stairs, disappearing through the door without a word. James exhaled sharply, his body sagging with relief. He couldn't believe it. They were still alive. For now. Emily looked up at him, her face still pale, her eyes wide with shock. "What just happened?" she whispered. "I don't know," James muttered, shaking his head. "But they didn't find us. That's all that matters." He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had just been granted a brief reprieve. Whoever had sent that man would send more. They would come back, and next time, they wouldn't stop until they had Emily. "We need to leave. Now." Emily nodded quickly, and together, they moved toward the cellar door. James opened it cautiously, the cold air from outside rushing in, sending a chill through the already frigid room. Snow swirled in the darkness beyond, the storm still raging, but it was their only chance. They stepped out into the storm, the snow blinding them as they stumbled forward into the night. The wind howled, biting at their skin, but they pressed on, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. Behind them, the mansion loomed in the darkness, a fortress that could no longer protect them. The real storm had begun. The storm swallowed them whole the moment they stepped outside. The wind lashed at their faces, the snow so thick it was like walking through a white void. Each step felt treacherous, the icy ground threatening to send them crashing down. James kept his hand firmly on Emily's shoulder, guiding her as they stumbled through the blizzard, but even he was struggling to see more than a few feet ahead. "We need to keep moving," James shouted over the howling wind, though his voice was barely audible over the storm's deafening roar. "The cellar leads out near the woods. If we make it there, we might have a chance to lose them." Emily didn't respond, but he felt her nod beneath the hood of her robe, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from fear. He knew that every part of her wanted to give up, to collapse into the snow and let the terror wash over her. But they couldn't stop now. Whoever had been sent into the house was still out there. They would regroup, follow the trail, and when they did, James knew they wouldn't stop until they had Emily, or until both of them were dead. The snow battered against their faces as they trudged onward, their footsteps swallowed immediately by the wind and ice. It felt as though they were walking through a nightmare, the kind where every effort to move forward seemed futile, like the world was conspiring to pull them back. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the tree line. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, the tall pines swaying violently in the storm. James felt a flicker of hope. If they could make it deep enough into the forest, the snow and trees might cover their tracks. Maybe they could hide long enough for whoever was after them to give up the chase. "This way," he said, pulling Emily along as they stumbled into the forest. The wind was slightly weaker here, the trees offering some protection from the brunt of the storm, but the cold still bit through their clothes. James could feel the numbness creeping into his fingers and toes, but he forced himself to ignore it. There wasn't time to think about the pain. They moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the snow crunching beneath their feet. Every sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of branches, made James's heart race, his ears straining for any hint of pursuit. But the storm covered everything. It was both a blessing and a curse. No one could see them, but they couldn't hear anyone coming either. After several minutes of pushing through the thick underbrush, James finally spotted a small clearing up ahead. He pulled Emily toward it, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps, their bodies on the edge of exhaustion. When they reached the clearing, he stopped, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. "We can rest here. Just for a moment," he panted, trying to steady his breathing. Emily collapsed next to him, her legs shaking beneath her as she sat down in the snow, pulling the robe tighter around her shivering frame. Her face was pale, and her lips were starting to turn blue from the cold. They didn't have much time before the cold became as dangerous as the people hunting them. "Do you think they're still following us?" Emily whispered, her voice hoarse and fragile. James glanced back in the direction they had come from, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. He couldn't see anything, just the swirling snow and the dark silhouettes of trees. But he knew better than to believe they were safe. "They'll be coming," he said grimly. "They know you're out here. They won't stop." Emily's face crumpled, her fear taking hold again. "James, what if we can't escape them? What if they find us out here?" James knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders tightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Listen to me," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the fear in the air. "We've made it this far. I don't care who they are or what they want. You are not going back with them. We're going to survive this. Do you understand me?" Emily stared at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." James squeezed her shoulder gently, offering a faint smile. "Good. We just need to keep moving." But before they could stand, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. James froze, his body going rigid as his instincts flared to life. He slowly turned toward the direction of the noise, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the creaking of trees under the weight of the snow. But then, there it was again, a distant snap of branches like someone, or something, was moving toward them. "They're here," Emily breathed, her voice barely a whisper. James's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the woods, searching for any sign of movement. The snow made it impossible to see anything clearly, but he knew they were closing in. He grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We have to go. Now." They stumbled forward, back into the dense trees, their footsteps quick and desperate. The cold air burned in James's lungs as they pushed deeper into the forest, but he couldn't stop. The cracking of branches behind them grew louder, closer. Whoever was following them was moving fast, too fast. James's mind raced, trying to figure out a way to slow them down, to buy time. His eyes scanned the trees, looking for anything, a place to hide, a path they could take. But the snow was everywhere, blinding them, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly, the ground beneath James's feet gave way. He yelped in surprise as he slid down a steep embankment, the snow pulling him down into a hidden ravine. He hit the bottom with a thud, his body aching from the impact, but he quickly scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide as he looked up. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice strained with panic. Emily stood at the top of the embankment, her eyes wide with fear as she looked down at him. She started to move toward the edge, but before she could take a step, the sound of footsteps behind her froze her in place. James's heart lurched in his chest. He could see the shadow of someone, no, several people, emerging from the trees behind her, their figures barely visible in the swirling snow. "Emily!" James shouted again, his voice filled with desperation. "Run!" But it was too late. The shadows closed in around her, and she let out a soft, terrified cry. The last thing James saw before the figures dragged her into the trees was her face, her wide eyes locking with his, a silent plea for help. "No!" James screamed, scrambling to climb up the embankment, his hands clawing at the snow. But his feet slipped, and he crashed back down, helplessly watching as Emily was swallowed by the storm. The sound of her cries echoed through the forest, but they were growing fainter, disappearing into the wind. James's chest heaved as panic surged through him, his mind screaming at him to get up, to fight, to do something. But his body refused to cooperate. The exhaustion, the cold, the fear. It all crashed over him like a wave, leaving him paralyzed. For a long moment, there was nothing but the howl of the wind and the soft crunch of the snow beneath his shaking hands. James closed his eyes, his breath ragged as guilt and terror twisted inside him. He had failed her. But then, through the chaos, he heard something. Something faint, something distant but unmistakable. A voice. A whisper. James. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. The voice was coming from somewhere deep within the forest, somewhere beyond the storm. It was Emily. She was still alive. James's resolve hardened, his fear turning into something else, something sharper, more dangerous. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him, but he ignored the pain, the exhaustion. There was no time for weakness. "Hold on, Emily," he muttered under his breath. "I'm coming." He took a deep breath, turned toward the forest, and ran into the storm. The wind roared in James's ears as he plunged deeper into the storm, his heart racing, his breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. The cold was unbearable, biting through his clothes and numbing his skin, but he didn't care. All that mattered now was finding Emily. He had to reach her. He had to. His boots crunched against the snow as he sprinted through the forest, the trees blurring around him as he moved. His body screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain, through the exhaustion. Every part of him ached, but his mind was consumed by one single, desperate thought. "I can't lose her again." "Emily!" he shouted into the wind, his voice hoarse and ragged. But the storm swallowed his words, the howling wind drowning out everything except the pounding of his heart. The whisper of her voice, "James," still echoed in his mind, like a ghost pulling him forward, guiding him through the swirling snow. He had heard her. She was still alive. And that thought alone kept him moving, kept him fighting against the storm. The shadows around him seemed to stretch, dark shapes lurking at the edges of his vision. Every snapping branch, every gust of wind made his heart race, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not until he found her. Then, just ahead, through the thick curtain of snow, James spotted movement, dark figures, moving swiftly through the trees. His heart leapt into his throat. It was them, the people who had taken her. He could see their shapes now, barely visible in the storm, but they were there, dragging Emily between them. She was struggling, her feet stumbling in the deep snow, but she was alive. James could hear her faint cries, her voice trembling with fear as she fought against her captors. "Emily!" he shouted again, louder this time. His voice fueled by desperation. One of the figures turned, glancing back at him. Even through the blizzard, James could see the cold, emotionless gaze that met his. A man with a hood pulled low over his face, his eyes devoid of anything human. He didn't flinch, didn't react to James's scream. He simply nodded to the others and continued pulling Emily forward, as though James were nothing more than an insect to be ignored. James's rage flared, hot and blinding. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not again. With a surge of adrenaline, he charged forward, his feet slipping in the snow as he closed the distance between them. His hand tightened around the crowbar he had brought from the house, the cold metal biting into his palm. He didn't care how many of them there were. He was going to get her back. The figures ahead moved faster, dragging Emily through the snow, but James was gaining on them. His heart pounded in his chest as he raised the crowbar, ready to strike. Just as he reached them, one of the men turned, moving with unnatural speed. Before James could react, a fist collided with his chest, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled backward, gasping for breath, but he didn't fall. He couldn't afford to fall. He swung the crowbar wildly, the metal cutting through the air with a sharp whistle. It connected with the man's shoulder, the impact sending a jolt through James's arm. The man staggered back, but he barely flinched, his cold eyes narrowing as he advanced on James again. James swung again, but this time, the man dodged easily, his movements too fast, too precise. Before James could react, the man grabbed his wrist, twisting it painfully. The crowbar fell from his hand, clattering into the snow. "No," James growled, fighting against the man's iron grip. He tried to free himself, but the man was too strong, his hand like a vice around James's wrist. With a quick, brutal motion, the man shoved James to the ground, the force of the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Snow flew up around him as he hit the ground hard, his body aching from the fall. The man stood over him, emotionless, as if James were nothing more than an inconvenience. James's vision blurred, the cold seeping into his bones as he struggled to rise. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep fighting. He couldn't let them take her. "Emily," he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. But just as the man reached for him, a loud crack rang out through the storm. The man froze, his head snapping to the side. His grip on James loosened, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sharp, pained gasp, the man staggered back, clutching his chest. Blood bloomed across his coat, dark and thick, staining the snow beneath him. James blinked, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The man collapsed to the ground, his body twitching once before going still. Someone had shot him. James's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the storm for the source of the gunshot. Through the blinding snow, he spotted a figure moving toward him, tall, dressed in a thick coat, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Eric!" James gasped, relief flooding through him. Eric nodded, his eyes sharp and focused as he approached, his rifle still raised. "I've been tracking them," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You've got more coming from the east. We need to move now." James didn't hesitate. He spun around, his eyes locking onto Emily, who had collapsed in the snow, her body trembling with exhaustion. He ran to her, dropping to his knees as he pulled her into his arms. "Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you. You're safe now." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glassy with fear, but she nodded weakly, her hands clutching his coat. I thought they were going to take me again." "Not this time," James said fiercely, his grip tightening around her. "Not ever again." Eric glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the trees. "We don't have much time. More are coming, and I don't have enough ammo to hold them off for long." James nodded, pulling Emily to her feet. "Let's get out of here." They moved quickly, Eric leading the way as they made their way through the snow, the wind howling around them. Emily leaned heavily against James, her body weak from the ordeal, but she kept moving, her steps unsteady but determined. As they reached the edge of the forest, the storm began to ease, the wind dying down slightly. The world beyond the trees was still covered in a thick blanket of snow, but the swirling chaos of the blizzard was beginning to fade. They pushed forward, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, but the adrenaline kept them going. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the clearing at the edge of the property. James's mansion stood in the distance, still standing but dark and ominous, its windows shattered from the earlier struggle. "We'll be safe once we reach the house," Eric said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But we need to hurry." James nodded, but his heart was still pounding. The people who had come for Emily, they weren't just random criminals. They were something more, something dangerous. And James knew they wouldn't stop. But as he looked down at Emily, her face pale but alive, he felt a surge of fierce determination. They had survived. They had escaped the storm. And as long as they were together, James knew he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, no matter what was coming next.